Like Emerson before him, Herman Melville was enamored of the sublime. What is the sublime? The sublime is an aesthetic category that was quite popular in the late 18th, early 19th century in both England and America, indeed in Europe at large, that described an aesthetic experience that was the opposite of an experience of the beautiful. Immanuel Kant in Germany and Edmund Burke in England both developed this distinction between an experience of the beautiful and an experience of the sublime. Even though there are significant differences between these two thinkers, for our purposes, I'll focus on their similarities. For both Kant and Burke, an experience of the beautiful is an experience that feels harmonious, comforting, secure, symmetrical. We might think in this regard of a beautifully landscaped garden. This would be beautiful. A well-written sonnet or a harmoniously rendered landscape painting. These would be beautiful. In contrast, an experience of the sublime causes anxiety, fear, terror, unease. Of course, it's an aesthetic experience, so one must be out of danger to experience the sublime. But think about, say, standing on the shore of an ocean with a strong current at night, or looking over the edge of a vast canyon, maybe the Grand Canyon, or even just lying on your back and looking up at the stars at night, witnessing a tornado or some other natural disaster. These phenomena are what can evoke the sublime. Kant ultimately says that our minds are the most sublime organs because the mind can intuit infinity, but we won't get into that. Suffice it to say that a sublime experience is duplicitous. How so? Even though we feel unease, even though we feel terror, even though we feel discomfort, at the same time we are exhilarated by this unease, this terror, this discomfort. Why? Because we also sense great power. We sense boundlessness. We sense plenitude. We perhaps sense eternity. We perhaps sense the infinite. These are the concepts that a sublime experience can inspire within us. So the fear of the sublime experience is often balanced by fascination. The feeling of being overwhelmed by the world is often countered by a sense of powers that transcend the world. So certainly we can see why Emerson would be drawn to the sublime primarily as an experience of the natural world. One of his most famous passages, the transparent eyeball passage, shows him crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, and suddenly he becomes a transparent eyeball. I become nothing. I see all the currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God, or sometimes part or particle of God, depending on the edition. So for Emerson, simply feeling as if one is in harmony with the vast powers of nature make one feel as if one's ego, just discrete ego, vanishes, and you feel as if you are one with infinite powers. This is an exhilarating experience of the sublime, a transcendentalist experience of the sublime. If we move to someone like Poe or someone like Melville, the sublime, while exhilarating, can also be more horrifying than it often is in Emerson. So obviously the sublime plays a major part in Melville's Moby-Dick. Ishmael makes it very clear from the very beginning that one of the draws of going to sea is the sublimity of the ocean, the sublimity of the whale. The ocean with untapped depths, the ocean with seemingly infinite vistas, the ocean filled with violent animals that will kill you. The ocean is terrifying to Ishmael and to Ahab, but also it's exhilarating at the same time. Same with the whale. Ishmael spends chapter after chapter talking about how the whale has a kind of grandeur that ultimately makes it beyond our ability to describe it. And this is a part of the sublime that Immanuel Kant really develops, the idea that when we have a sublime experience, it's ultimately an experience where our mind is unable to create a concept or an image that can capture what we are experiencing. So a sublime experience is a crisis of representation, that I'm feeling something so grand and plenteous, abundant, seemingly boundless, seemingly infinite, that I simply cannot represent it to myself. So Ishmael is very clear that the sea, and more importantly, the whale, given their mysteries, given their sphinx-like qualities, given their depths, given their murkiness, given their ancientness, ultimately overwhelm our cognitive powers to find images and concepts for them. And this is both overwhelming, it's frustrating to be unable to represent something I want to represent, but also, again, it's exciting. So this brings me to where I want to focus on this little talk. And that is that obviously both Ishmael and Ahab, for all their differences, are similar in that they are drawn to the sea for its vastness, for its sublimity. But Ahab ultimately wants to control the inscrutability of the sea. Even though he speaks about the inscrutability in a bold and nervous, lofty language, this is how Ishmael describes the Quaker-like Shakespearean diction that Ahab uses, a bold and lofty, nervous language. Even though Ahab uses a powerful, bold and lofty, nervous language to talk about his desire to control the inscrutable, still, nonetheless, he is endlessly irritated, indeed rendered deeply melancholy by the possibility that ultimately existence is a riddle all insoluble, and the white whale symbolizes this insolubility the most potently to him. There's a moment when he looks at Queequeg, who has tattoos all over his body. And the tattoos were put there by an old prophet in the religion of his island. So there's a whole theory of the heavens and the earth inscribed upon his body, but he's forgotten the meaning. And so at a certain point, Ahab looks at Queequeg and he goes, "Oh, you gods, you tantalize us," meaning you give us hints of the possibility of explaining things. You give us hints of the possibility of solving the riddles of existence, but ultimately we must remain benighted. So, what I'm saying about Ahab is he's a character who is complicated. He weirdly, he desires control in a profession that is eminently suited to give one almost no control. One would think he would have stayed home and been an accountant if he hates inscrutability so much. But this is part of the vastness of Ahab's soul. Ahab is clearly a man who is inspired by the sea, inspired by the hunt of the whale. And this inspiration is behind his great Shakespearean language. His speeches sound like King Lear. His speeches sound like Hamlet. His speeches sound like Macbeth. And in these speeches, he's trying to describe his great dilemma. I want to solve the riddle of existence. And the best way to solve it, he says, is to strike through it, to use your lance, to strike through all the mysteries and to penetrate beyond them and see what's behind the veils of the natural world. All visible things are but pasteboard masks, he said. And what if we stick our lance through the pasteboard mask? What's back there? Maybe we can solve the mystery. Maybe we can understand the riddle. Maybe nothing's behind the veil. Maybe only malignity is behind the veil. But ultimately, Ahab wants to be able to map the ocean with his chart to the point where he can predict where MOBY-DICK is going to be. He's pretty successful, and he wants to kill MOBY-DICK. And in his monomaniacal way, he seems to think that this will allow him essentially to destroy all the mystery and all the evil that is chagrins him so deeply. Ishmael is the opposite. He's quite clear that the inscrutability of the whale, well, he's obsessed with it. He's constantly talking about how the whale defies classification. This is what the cetology chapter is all about. He says, okay, I'm going to classify all the types of whales. Then he says, this is like categorizing the constituents of chaos. He says that this classification is but a draft. So there's a constant gap between our words and the world. There's a constant gap between how we want to represent the world to ourselves and what the world is really like. The whale itself, Ishmael is constantly saying, escapes our paintings. The whale escapes our mythologies. The whale escapes our sciences. We simply cannot name it, describe it, paint it once and for all. Do not despair over this. Ishmael sees this as an invitation to rise stylistically. For Ishmael, the sublimity of the whale is an invitation to try to write in such a style, such a fecund, superabundant style that actually nods toward the grandeur of the whale. There's a great example of this at the end of chapter 104, where he's talking about how the whale is so ancient. This is the fossil whale. This is the name of the chapter 104, where he says that when I stand among these mighty Leviathan skeletons, he's seen a skeleton of a whale, right? And he says, when I stand beside these mighty Leviathan skeletons, skulls, tusks, jaws, ribs, and vertebrae, all characterized by partial resemblances to the existing breeds of sea monsters, but at the same time bearing, on the other hand, similar affinities to the annihilated antichrononical Leviathans, their incalculable seniors. I am by a flood borne back to that wondrous period ere time itself can be said to have begun, for time began with man. Here Saturn's gray chaos rolls over me, and I obtain dim, shuddering glimpses into those polar eternities, when wedged bastions of ice pressed hard upon what are now the tropics. And in all the 25,000 miles of this world's circumference, not an inhabitable hand's breadth of land was visible. Then the whole world was the whale's, and, king of creation, he left his wake along the present lines of the Andes and the Himalayas. Who can show a pedigree like Leviathan? Ahab's harpoon had shed older blood than Pharaoh's. Methuselah seems a schoolboy. I look round to shake hands with Shem. I am horror-struck at this antimosaic, unsourced existence of the unspeakable terrors of the whale. So he's saying the whale predates time because it predates humans, and humans are the ones who start time. The whale comes before, he says the whale is anti-Mosaic. It comes before Moses. He says the whale is unsourced. We can't find an origin of it. He says the whale is unspeakable. We can't name it ultimately. So the language he uses is so vibrant. And ultimately he uses here what Samuel Johnson in the 18th century called a metaphysical conceit. Samuel Johnson was describing the stylistic tendencies of early 17th century poets like John Donne and George Herbert, who loved making outlandish comparisons between two radically unlike things. Famously, John Donne compared the blood inside a flea that had just bit him and his beloved to a bed in which the two of them had mingled and made love. So in the poem he says, "Look, my mistress, please go to bed with me." She's saying, "I don't want to." Why wouldn't you? Because the flea has bitten both of us. Our blood's already mingled in the flea. The flea is already a bed in which we have essentially made love. We've already done it. Let's do it again. That's the conceit. And another place, John Donne likens himself and the wife he will leave behind when he goes on a trip to two legs of a compass. And her leg will be stuck in London, and his leg will be in Holland, And so as he moves, she will move. So two people, a husband and a wife, are likened to a little compass. So these are radically unlike things treated as if they're somehow equal. Now, one of the great stylists in this regard of metaphysical conceit would be Sir Thomas Browne. Melville was deep in Sir Thomas Browne, who also loved writing about antiquities that were beyond any articulation. So here, Ishmael, in thinking about the whale, in thinking about his contact with the whale, can actually reach over and shake hands with a biblical figure, Shem. So you see how radically unlike in time. This figure from the Bible, Shem, who knows if he even existed, but a long time ago. But now suddenly he's here in the whale. And Ishmael, being close to the whale, is also here. So there's these radically unlike things, temporally speaking, widely apart, thousands of years apart, suddenly come together. Now, another great metaphysical conceit shows up in Ishmael's description of metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls. He talks about how after the sailors capture a whale and cut the whale up and burn the whale's blubber into oil and then clean up, it takes all this effort, all this labor. But then the very next day, someone sees a whale and, oh boy, we're going to go out again. So there's a sense of this endless circularity of existence. And Ishmael likens this to the transmigration of souls, basically saying that we're always behaving like sailors on a whale ship. We're working extremely hard to complete a task, and just when we finish completing the task, we have to do it over again, endlessly. And this has been going on for all time. So Ishmael thinks, because I'm behaving in this way, endless labor, I'm no different than someone who has done this in the past, like Pythagoras. Pythagoras, the philosopher who believed in the transmigration of souls. So here is what Ishmael says: "Oh, the metempsychosis, O Pythagoras, that in bright Greece 2,000 years ago did die, so good, so wise, so mild. I sailed with thee along the Peruvian coast last voyage, and, foolish as I am, taught thee, a green simple boy, how to splice a rope." So yet again we see Ishmael coming into contact with a figure from deep antiquity, not as deep as Shem, but deep antiquity. And here he sees Pythagoras as a shipmate, and he teaches him how to tie a knot. So these two metaphysical conceits, and they're two of many in this novel, are just one of many ways that Ishmael enacts this idea that the sublime is ultimately a muse, because the world is ungraspable, because the whale in particular symbolizes this ungraspability. For Ishmael, it's not an experience that leads him to frustration, but he yearns to attempt to describe what it's like to see a whale, knowing he will fail. That's one of the great ironies of the novel. I discussed this in another lecture on romantic irony in Moby-Dick. The idea that the world is beyond representation, but that's no reason not to try to represent it. Knowing your representation will fail. There's an exuberance of endlessly trying to represent something that can't be represented. There's always an invitation for moreness, because our language is always in a state of not enoughness. So one way that Ishmael figures this is by elevating his rhetoric in times when he's excited about the ineffability of the whale. And one way he elevates his rhetoric is by engaging in this technique of the metaphysical conceit, usually taking two radically unlike things because of separation in time and bringing them together. So we might say that in some ways Ahab suffers a crisis of the sublime. He experiences the sublime, but it makes him feel ultimately deep unease. Whereas Ishmael embraces the sublime as a kind of muse that calls forth his most potent and compelling language.